Hello everyone, I am Dr. Nick Truby and welcome to this week's episode of Fitness Lit Breakdown. The goal of this podcast is to review and break down peer-reviewed evidence-based literature dealing in the fitness and exercise world to come up with implementing real-world tools that you can use for your actual fitness and training. So this week I've got an article that deals with looking at supersets, and we're really looking at different ways of performing a superset. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what a superset is in the exercise world, it's when you pair two movements together with little to no rest in between. And there's different ways in which you can produce a superset of what we'll break down in a few minutes for this article, but we want to look at the differences between these supersets and how they may affect our ability to produce force, to produce velocity of a movement or power, and how hard we perceive ourselves working. Now, all of this will make sense when we start breaking this down in ways in which we can apply this into your training, whether you're trying to improve your strength or muscle size, or being able to produce more force more rapidly, okay, aka power, like we've talked about in the previous few episodes. But some amazing takeaway messages that you can use as tools in your own training, and I can't wait to jump into this article. So first of all, when you think about supersets, they were most of the time used earlier on in their origin as a means in more of an athletic type setting, because we're trying to either increase the amount of volume per given workout time, and that can be seen as being efficient with your time. It can be seen as squeezing in more work with your time. It can also be a way of increasing overall volume. Now, for the real world person, the desk jockey or the person just working to their own goals that aren't training for the Olympics or for the pros, we could see it as a way to implement a superset as a way to get as much work as we need to get done in less amount of time. So I'm dealing more so with overall efficiency of how we can best use our time in an overall training setting, because we have things to do in the real world. We have jobs, kids, tasks, chores, all kinds of things to get done. We don't always have hour-plus blocks to set aside for our workouts. So I'm going to speak to this in terms of efficiency and how we can do the same amount of work that we wish to get done and do it in a little bit shorter time frame. That's the goal of a superset. Now, when you think about a superset, you have to think about, is it appropriate for all levels of training? Now, I argue that you need to have some background in training. You need to have some training age, as we call it. So training age would be if you were consistently exercising a structured form of exercising for maybe 6 to 10 months and being very consistent with that, then that person would be seen as more of an advanced training age and being able to better handle a higher training stress. So I think this is more applicable for a person that maybe has a more advanced training age, so to speak. But it also could be used for more of a beginner, but really making sure we're pairing the appropriate exercises together, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So we have three forms of supersets that have been looked at in the literature. So this is not just going into a Gold's Gym and talking to the biggest guy or gal in the gym. These are actual peer-reviewed evidence-based data we're going to review here, that we can look at actual numbers and see how these types of supersets affect different parameters of our fitness. So the three types we're going to break down in this article are, first of which is called Agonist Antagonist. Now, those are just kind of scientific words to explain which muscles are being used when. So the agonist muscle is the muscle that's directly involved in making the action happen. So for a bicep curl, when you're curling upward and your hand comes closer to your shoulder and your elbow is flexing, the agonist muscle in that case is the bicep. It's directly responsible for the movement. On the flip side, the agonist is the muscle that is lengthening on the opposing side of the joint, allowing for that action to take place. So for the bicep curl, the antagonist would be the triceps, okay? So in this case, the agonist antagonist would be pairing two exercises that would pair agonist first, right? Bicep curl would be number one, and then directly following without any rest break would be the tricep extension. So flipping those two, where the agonist before would become the antagonist and vice versa. That is the first one and probably the most common form of superset out there. The next is called alternate peripheral, and this is where we're pairing two kind of structural movements together typically involving either different parts of the body. So in this case, it would be like a barbell bench press, and then jumping straight into a barbell back squat. So two very structured structural movements that require a lot of energy to make happen, but we're essentially giving ourselves time to recover on jumping in between those two exercises, giving time for the upper body to recover while you're doing lower body. But at the same time, I think our perceived effort would be likely higher because both are very demanding energetically. The third type that's been studied is called similar biomechanical. So if you want to think about movements that basically are almost the same in the muscle groups we're using, the movement patterns we're producing, the joints that are actually being involved are almost the same. So in this case, it would be the dumbbell bench press and the barbell bench press. So going straight from a dumbbell bench press right into a barbell bench press, you can see where the fatigue would be accruing over time to where we're really having to work hard to make that happen depending on our intensity that we're using, aka how much weight we're lifting in each one of those. So you can see where that would be more challenging and likely to be better suited for more of an advanced person that has the capacity to produce more work. So those are the three that this article broke down specifically and then compared directly. So this is really one of the only articles, and this is brand new research, just came out a few years ago, that really was the first one to directly compare these different forms of supersets, as opposed to just taking one of those and comparing it to a control group, which we'll talk about in a second. So just to kind of get your brain thinking here, which one may be better suitable for maintaining a certain ability to produce force, which one might be more fatigue inducing. We have some research they've cited here, which is always nice to review in the introduction section. If you looked at using that agonist antagonist, in some studies, it actually increased your ability to produce power over time, because those muscles that on the antagonist side are being taken through a range of motion, and that sometimes can allow you, if you do those immediately after and those antagonists become the agonists, they're better able to produce force because they're almost in a sense warmed up and ready to produce force because you've kind of taken them through that nice range of motion. We've activated them but not really made them work super hard, so we've increased all those things within the muscle that allow us to recruit the muscle and produce force. So sometimes using that strategy, we can improve our ability to produce force in very specific types of measurements. On the flip side, if we look at the similar biomechanical superset, we tend to see decreases in our ability to produce either the speed of a movement or how much power we can produce, or maybe even the amount of reps we can do, because you can see where doing essentially the same movement and then doing it again without any rest, we're already just, even if you've never really exercised before, or if you have, you can see where that would be very challenging to be able to sustain that kind of work output over a longer period of time. So we know that, yes, all three forms of these superset strategies can improve our training efficiency, but that's more so time. Maybe it's not so much in the effect of what we're actually doing to our physiology. And that's really the point of this exercise. So this article also talks about how it may be negatively impacting our neuromuscular function. So that speaks more to the peripheral fatigue we've talked about in previous episodes, where we looked at central fatigue, which is talking about the brain, your ability and your desire and your will to produce a certain amount of force over a period of time. That's more central fatigue. The peripheral component is down at the junction between the nerve and the muscle, and then within the muscle itself. So all those different substrates and hormones and neurotransmitters and byproducts of energy being produced and used, the muscle, if you want to think about it this way, gets very clogged up. The more you have to put that high output energy, the more byproducts you produce. And those byproducts have to go somewhere. And sometimes they kind of bounce around and compete for certain positions to where essentially you start to fatigue because of kind of that traffic jam that takes place within the muscle and at the junction between the nerve and the muscle. So that's more so peripheral fatigue. So they talk about how this is affecting your neuromuscular functioning at the peripheral level, and that translates into your perceived exertion, essentially, how hard you feel like you're working. So they go into some of that as well, but I want to stick to, on this discussion, let's do a direct comparison of the three, and let's see which one might be best suitable for you to use as tools in your training program, because I think this strategy can be used for everybody. Maybe not each of these three may not be best suitable, but I think no matter where you are in your training level, I think you can take some really great takeaway messages from this article and use it in your training. So the aim of this study was to assess the effects of the 3 different types of our supersets on kinetic, kinematic, and RPE changes during the bench press exercise. So they looked at the bench press as basically their main outcome measure. And all that really means is we want to see what other things affect the bench press. Okay, so we're going to do other things and see how those will affect your ability to produce force during the bench press. Now, I'm not expecting everybody to know what kinetic and kinematic mean, so I'll do a real quick review on that because I think that'll make sense as we move forward in talking about some of the measures that this study looked at. So kinetics is looking more at the forces that are actually being produced. So what's causing the motion, what's changing motion, what forces are being produced, that's speaking directly towards kinetics. Kinematics is looking at the mechanisms that kind of reference those forces, right? It could be velocity, it could be displacement, right? How far did something move from point A to point B? How fast did it travel? Those types of things are more kinematic in nature. So we want to see, did velocity affect force? Did force affect velocity, vice versa? And speaking specifically to the bench press while we incorporate different types of superset strategies. So hopefully that makes sense as we move forward here, because this study did a great job of really doing as much as they can to control and really look at what are we actually seeing from those 3 different supersets and not allowing much external bias to take place around this investigation. So let's jump into our methodology, because I think this is important to understand too, because this makes a lot of sense to the power of this study and how well we can take the data and use them. So there were only 10 subjects, which isn't huge, but they were all sub-elite adult rugby union players. So I believe they were all of a similar age, kind of college-aged males, 21 years old plus or minus. So I think this was also done in the United Kingdom, so likely kind of a university rugby team. I'm not sure, I'm not familiar with their setup, if they have varsity type sports as we do in the States or not, or if this was kind of a club group that was participating. So 10 very fit males that played rugby. We'll talk about some of their statistics because I think they're pretty impressive in terms of how strong they were. So it just kind of speaks to their training age. They're basically very trained people. And they had 4 different trials. So each of these 10 individuals took place in 4 specific trials. So they didn't have groups and comparing groups. We're comparing each person to each person, which is kind of nice. It's almost longitudinal in a sense, that we're looking at the group as a whole and how how the group is affected by each one of these strategies, and not doing like a cross-sectional where we just take a group A in Texas and a group B in Ohio and a group C and comparing. So it's kind of nice. So of the 4 different strategies we're going to talk about, the first is the control. So everybody came in, all 10 players came in and did a warm-up set on the barbell bench press at 65% of their 3-rep max. So they came in and performed kind of as a, before they jumped into the study, they found the 3 repetition maximum. Basically, it's very similar protocol like I've talked about in a previous episode about your 1-rep max, where you hone in and find, how much weight can you do on the bench press to get exactly 3 reps. That 4th one, you're trying to get up and it doesn't happen, right? So we've basically capped off and seen how much you can do 3 times. We've taken 65% of that because that's typically the intensity we start to see where that it's working very maximally. It's hard to do over a period of time because we want to see what happens over 3 sets of this. So if we did too much, the fatigue would likely just itself kind of start to murky the waters in terms of the data we're trying to see. But 65% of your 3-rep max, you can do 10 times and you can do them quite well over time, okay? And really see how much power you can produce during those 10 reps at 65% of your 3-rep max. So they came in 4 times and they were all randomized, which is nice. They didn't know exactly which one they were doing, so we're trying to eliminate some bias right there. They came in, did a control where they did a warm-up at that resistance I talked about, and then they did 10 reps at that same resistance, 65% of their 3-rep max, and did 10 reps. And for each one of those reps, they were instructed to lower down 2 seconds. So the eccentric phase, or the negative phase, was 2 seconds. And then they were told to produce the pressing phase with as much explosiveness as possible. So how fast can they possibly press that weight to the top? And the purpose of that is to see how much overall power we're producing. Like I've talked in the past, power is a measure of force times distance divided by time. So if we want to see how much power you can produce, the faster you can do something, the power is increased. So if we're doing this over 10 reps, we can get a mean power number, right? How much power did you produce on average? And then we can track that over time. And that's really what we're going to do here when we break this down in a few minutes. So that was done, 10 reps, boom, take a 2-minute break, repeat that 2 more times. So 3 sets of 10 reps of that resistance with 2-minute breaks in between. That was the control. Then they came in and did the 3 superset strategies, random times, right, with enough time in between to rest. I believe they had they had 7 days in between each testing session. So they give them a week in between each training session to really eliminate any form of fatigue or delayed onset muscle soreness or anything in that range or area to affect their ability to produce force in this specific protocol. So they came in at random times again and did the Agonist Antagonist setup, right? And the 2 exercises they used were obviously the barbell bench press, and the antagonist of that was the bent over row, where you're bent over with the barbell and you're doing that row exercise. So what they did was they did the same warm up. When they came in, did the first set of the bench press at 65% of the 3-rep max, did it 10 times, took a 5-minute rest. Then they went in and did the bench press, 10 reps, same thing with the squat. Okay, same exact 3 RM, 65% with their squat. Or sorry, not squat. I'm jumping ahead of myself. Of their bent over row. So bench press, jump right into bent over row, 2-minute break. Bench press, bent over row, 2-minute break, repeat. Okay, so 3 sets of that. And at the same time, we're really looking at, and we're measuring along with this, the bench press specifically in those power measures, right? How quickly were they pressing that barbell up over those 3 sets? Likely you can tell just probably something is going to start fatiguing. We're going to start seeing some results there. Next time they came in, remember these are all randomized, they did that alternate peripheral. And they did the barbell bench press again, right? That's still the same, that's the staple. And then they did the back squat. So same thing, they came in, did the warm up, then jumped into the 3 sets of bench press, back squat, 2-minute rest, bench press, back squat, 2 minutes rest, bench press, back squat. Tracked all those measures on the bench press. Last time they came in, or it could have been random again, right? It's all randomized. They did the similar biomechanics, and they did the barbell bench press and the dumbbell bench press. Same exact setup, okay? And this is where we really started comparing the fatigue. At what rate does that barbell bench press start to fatigue? And is it a result of how you're pairing these exercises together? Because this was really, we start diving into the exercise programming component, which movements are realistically the best to pair together if we are doing a superset, or even as part of a circuit in general. Because anytime you're doing a exercise programming for an athlete or an individual or an older adult, or no matter who we're talking about, we're always pairing exercises together, right? You're not gonna go to a training session and just do one exercise, 3 sets, and then jump to the next one. It would take you 3 hours to do your workout, right? So we're always pairing movements together. We need to understand which might be the best order of operations to do those exercises and give you the best results while still not making you feel like you're overworking yourself, giving yourself enough time to recover as part of in between those sets and in between exercises to produce the best results. That's the overall goal. How can we be super efficient with our time and super efficient with how we're working and still get the same results, if not better results? Okay, so those 10 rugby players they looked at, they had pretty impressive resistances. So their 3 RM on their bench press was 250 pounds. That's pretty good, right? They could do 250 3 times. Their back squat was 305 pounds. They could do that 3 times. And then their bent over row is 222 pounds. So almost identically matched for push and pull, which is pretty amazing on that bent over row barbell. It's pretty tough. And then for their dumbbell bench press was 190. So pretty dang good, pretty strong guys. And they had at least 2 years of very specific structural training under their belt. So fit guys, training age, pretty advanced. So they were pretty confident in applying these 3 strategies to these gentlemen. All right, let's jump forward. Let's look at some of the results. I feel like you've got a pretty good idea of what they did and how they did the procedure in terms of their exercise protocol. between just the control, where we just did bench press for 4 sets. Sorry, warm up in 3 sets and tracked how much force or power is being produced for each of those 3 sets. They came in and did the bench press and bent over row, warm up in 3 sets. They came in and did the back squat and bench press 3 sets, came in and did the dumbbell bench press and barbell bench press 3 sets. And always looking at that main outcome measure of barbell bench press. So this could be essentially any form of exercise. If you want to try and replicate this strategy for your own personal self, maybe you're trying to figure out the best way to organize certain exercises as part of your own programming. And you can try this with any exercise, right? Maybe you're focusing on back squat for the month of June, right? And you want to see how strong you can get on the back squat. Maybe use the back squat as you start to manipulate other movements around the back squat to see what gives you the best result. In this case, we're speaking directly to the bench press, but you can do this for essentially any exercise. Okay. So in the kinematic and kinetic measures we looked at, I'm going to speak, when I get into the results section here, specifically to the velocity. How quickly were the bench pressers pushing up, right, from their chest to the top of the rep? How fast, in terms of their velocity, was it going? Because they were instructed to do it as quickly as possible. And look at how much power they were producing doing so, okay? And I'm going to give you the percent differences or decreases in each of those 3 trials. I think that really hits home. We can start to see some themes here as we move forward between these 3 different types of ways of doing supersets. Now they also asked for RPE. I think this is always nice. Anytime you can collect this data, even for yourself, if you want to track this over time or during a workout and just track this, mark it down and review it with each week. It's a great tool to use to see how hard you were working. And maybe you might have weeks of working very high. Then you might need to take a step back and do almost like a restoration type week to where you're not working as hard. So this is a great tool you can use for yourself as well. But RPE is that rating of perceived exertion. And they used a modified Borg scale. And all that means is they went from 1 to 10. 1 being my effort seemed very minimal. 5 meaning like, okay, we're starting to work here, but it was just kind of moderate, it wasn't too crazy. 10 being like, that's all I got. It's as much as I can possibly do. I have nothing left in the tank. Okay, so 1 to 10. We'll talk about the differences of their RPE between those 3 groups, and you can really see the differences there with how much they thought they were working. Okay, so let me get my paper here. I've got these beautiful charts and tables that this article produced for us, and I reran some data because they kind of reported the data in a kind of a funky term or a funky way that's a little more challenging for just the person off the street to pick it up and look at it. So I kind of produced a percent difference or percent decrease from a baseline level, okay? So let's talk about mean velocity. Velocity meaning, how quickly did the bar go from the chest to the top of the rep, okay? And they reported meters per second. That's not important. You're not being tested on this anytime soon. But the number I'll give you is always from the baseline level. Baseline being when they first came in for that workout that day. If you recall, they did a 10 reps at 65% of their 3 RM for the bench press. That was their baseline measure. They kept that number. Then they tracked it from set 1 to set 2 to set 3 to see what changed in their ability to produce that speed from the bar going from the chest to the top of the rep. So from baseline to the 3rd set, in the control group, we saw an 8% decrease from baseline. So that's pretty much expected, right? We all obviously know that there's gonna be some inherent fatigue that's being produced, even if you just did bench press, 2-minute rest, bench press, 2-minute rest, bench press, not including any other workout or exercises within that, right? It's just the control group. For the agonist antagonist, for the bench press and row, we saw a 16% decrease from baseline for the bench press. So basically double in the loss of velocity just by including another workout in there, this specifically to the antagonist of the bench press. The alternate peripheral, right, this is where they did the bench press and the back squat. There was an 18.5% decrease in the bench press, the velocity of the bench press from the baseline to the 3rd set. It's a little bit greater decrease, and I'll talk about that, why that was in a little bit. In the similar biomechanical, there was a 51% decrease from baseline. Now that shouldn't surprise anybody because you've basically done twice the amount of work targeting the exact same muscles, the exact almost identical movement pattern using the same joints, so you can really see where the accumulation of fatigue would take place when you basically do the back-to-back movement of that exercise. Even if you're just changing barbell to dumbbell, you're essentially doing the same movements. Okay, so 51% decrease in the bench press, the velocity of that press going from the chest to the top of the rep in that third set compared to baseline. So right away, boom, that's like a huge difference, okay? So fatigue is real there. And I'm gonna guess their RPE, how hard they thought they were working, was much higher as well, which I'll report here in a little bit as well. So that was velocity. So what happened to power? Because velocity is a cool number to look at, and they use the appropriate, I didn't mention this before, but they use the appropriate tools to actually measure this in a repeatable and replicable pattern. They used the correct technology to do so. So they didn't just kind of pull out the stopwatch and tape measure. They were using some actual tech here. So for mean power, they looked at your overall average power produced over the 10 reps for each one of those sets. So you did 10 reps, they got power measurements for each rep, they added all those 10 reps divided by 10, and then they got your mean power output. So let's talk about the control group. So just from the baseline, right, the very first warm-up set of bench press, control, they only lost a little over 4% of power being produced from the third set compared to baseline. So that's pretty dang good. So if we're looking at just maintaining power and wanting to train power specifically for a very specific movement pattern, maybe just doing bench press by itself without incorporating anything else, or if you're doing back squat or deadlift or whatever that might be, maybe just doing that by itself is the best way to train for power specifically on that day, right? So you may want, if you're doing like a deadlift and that's going to be part of your workout that day, you may want to do the warm-up set and then very specifically do whatever resistance you've assigned yourself or being assigned, do that set with a 2 to 3 minute break in between, and just take those first 10 to 12 minutes and knock the deadlift out, and then do the rest of your workout. If you're really wanting to focus on deadlift power or bench press power or whatever that is for the day. Okay, I think that's a great takeaway message right there, because we're seeing very minimal decreases in power production from from warm up to set 3. I think that's an amazing takeaway message. Now, if we look at agonist antagonist, bench press, bent over row, we're seeing a 16% decrease in average power from the baseline to set 3. So, I mean, 16% is not crazy. I don't think that's anything detrimental to write home about and say, oh my gosh, this shouldn't be done, okay? On the alternate peripheral, where the bench press and back squat were being done, it was a 19% decrease of power from baseline to third set. And then, as you can imagine, the similar biomechanical was a 53% decrease in power from the warm-up set to the third set. So you're producing half the amount of power you were producing when you first started. Now, I think that's super significant, and that can be taken a few different ways. I may be jumping the gun here and kind of chatting here before I should, but while we're on the topic, I think this is a great time to talk about it. In that, yes, that might not be the best strategy to look at training for power specifically, right? By doing that similar biomechanical, because we're seeing huge decreases in powers from set 1 to set 3. And if I'm training for power specifically, I want to be able to push that bar as fast as I can, because I'm stimulating my nervous system a very specific way. I'm recruiting specific muscles in a very specific pattern, in a very specific flow. Neurologically, that would make sense to produce power and then transmit that power in a real world setting. If I'm doing that similar biomechanical, I'm not maximizing that avenue to produce power the best way I can, okay? On the flip side of that, we're essentially, if we're decreasing power, like I said before, we also decreased our rep velocity by 51%. So essentially, we're taking more time per set to do those same 10 reps, because we're taking twice or almost twice as long to press the bar from the chest to the top on average, right? So really not working towards power from that component, but now we're really starting to hone in on, maybe we're working more towards strength, because our time under tension right? That's kind of a physiological, scientific way to explain, how long is the muscle working at a very specific intensity, right? So if it takes me 1 second to press the bar compared to 5 seconds to press the bar, I was under tension, right? My muscles were under tension and working for 4 more seconds compared to me pressing it at 1 second, right? And that specifically looks at, we've increased essentially volume, even though our numbers look the same. Volume is, if you're kind of reading between the lines, volume is kind of higher at that point because the muscle is working more over a longer period of time. And that speaks more to increases in overall strength and muscle size. Okay, so, and this shouldn't surprise anybody if they're hip to ever doing this kind of superset where you pair 2 exercises together involving the exact same muscle groups. This shouldn't surprise anybody because it'd probably be likely harder because you're not letting yourself recover and then using the same muscles. And you're really having to grunt out those last few reps, right? You're gritting your teeth and you're sweating and all that good stuff. And maybe even dropping a few curse words if that's your thing. But we're really, focusing on improving our muscle size and overall strength. Not to say that wouldn't affect power, but I think you can produce power and train for power much differently, okay? So similar biomechanical, we're starting to see some trends here. Maybe that's not the best way to train specifically for power, but maybe it's the best way if you've got the capacity for that type of work and the amount of work, training more towards strength and overall muscle size. Okay, so we've seen those are the 2 main things I'm going to report here. I think those are the 2 easiest and most applicable ways to look at these data and see that velocity, your ability to produce that velocity and produce power is decreasing no matter which strategy you use, even if it was just a control group, right? Even if it was just you going in and doing bench press and bench press only, you're still fatiguing, but not as a high of rate compared to the other superset strategies. All right, we'll dive into that in a second here too as we wrap this up. But the rating of perceived exertion, as you can imagine as well, the control group was around 3. So 3 out of 10 in terms of those 10 guys thinking of how hard they were actually working, their perceived effort, right? So just doing bench press, 3 warm up and then 3 sets of just bench press only, RPE of 3. It went up to 4 for the agonist antagonist, so not a very big jump, so nothing crazy there. The alternate peripheral went up to 5 RPE, so 5 out of 10, not too crazy. The similar biomechanical went up to 8.2 out of 10. So these people, when they did the similar biomechanics, you were working, right? If you've ever done that strategy of supersetting, I have personally, you definitely are working much harder because the fatigue sets in and the weight doesn't get any lighter and you're still being called on to produce the same amount of reps. So your overall effort increases. So this being the first study to compare those 3 types of supersets to a control group, that being very key here, we need that control group to see where those differences really start to emerge compared to just doing bench press and bench press only. And I think that's very key in this study here as well. So a couple takeaway messages that I want you to leave here with. Number 1 being, if you want to focus on a specific exercise, maybe it's if you think about your workout for the day. For me personally, if I'm doing like a squat or a deadlift or any movement that is technical in its technique, right, or the form you have to produce to maintain posture and do it correctly, how much of your body are you using? How many joints are being active? How much muscle is being engaged? Those between the mental capacity of you having to do sound technique and the physical component of you doing that and demanding it with X number of weight is very taxing to your physiology, meaning you're going to accrue fatigue, right? If you want to do that very quickly, aka produce more power, these types of exercises should be done very early on in your training, 30 minutes or hour, whatever you've got set aside, right? That training session, those exercises specifically should be done first, okay? So more technical movements, more structural movements like the back squat, front squat, deadlift, bench press, whatever that might be, should be done first, followed by whatever you've got planned for the rest of the day, okay? It could be done 2 different ways. Like I mentioned before, it can be done by itself if you're really focusing on that movement specifically and you want to increase your ability to produce power over time. do it by itself without incorporating any other movements. Now, I don't know if you've got, it might require you to spend an extra 10 minutes or 15 minutes of your overall training time to do that. But also worrying about, you still have to be very regimented with your rest breaks. So in this case, usually a 2 to 3 minute rest break is plenty. So if you want to focus on improving back squat power, warm up, do your set, 2 minute rest, your set, 2 minute rest, your set, 2 minute rest, then jump into the rest of your workout. Or if you've kind of gotten to the point to where you have a higher capacity to handle a training load and over time to do that, I would still do it as the very first movement or workout as part of a set of workouts. So maybe you got a circuit of 3 or 4 exercises. That back squat or bench press should be number 1, followed by the other ones that follow. Likely those might be more single joint to where they don't involve as much effort, they don't involve as much muscle and crossing as many joints, which basically means you can recover more quickly from them compared to a big structural type exercise, okay? So that's very important, is order of operations or order of exercise. Now let's talk about which one might be most suitable for you, okay? So of the 3, I think the straight up the alternate peripheral and the agonist antagonist can be used for essentially anyone. So if it's a beginner, I think you could easily do that bench press followed by a row. Now you might consider intensity, number 1, what you might manipulate the most, because you might want to start off at a lower intensity, aka a lower amount of weight being used if you're going to jump from one exercise to the next. But I see nothing wrong with doing a bench press and then a row, or a knee extension and a knee flexion, right, to focus on either side of the leg, back to back with no rest, as long as we're not, overworking ourselves if we're not there yet in terms of our fitness or training age or whatever that might be. So I think those 2 are very suitable, agonist antagonist or alternate peripheral. I think that makes total sense if you're creating a circuit or a list of workouts of exercises that can be done in sequence with little to no rest in between, making sure that whatever you pick, you're essentially not doing the exact same muscle group back to back, or upper body or lower body, however you want to mix that up, to allow for inter-set rest before you hit that next set, okay? I think the biggest one is when you look at the similar biomechanical, that might be best suited for a person that has more experience in a resistance training setting that can handle a back-to-back same muscle group type workout. Mainly thinking of having adaptations that are strong enough structurally within the muscle to handle that amount of work perform back-to-back, and then at the same time being able to recover quickly from that. Because I think a beginner, if they did that, maybe they could handle 1 or 2 sets of that. But on the flip side, it might take X number of days longer to recover in between days and training sessions compared to a more advanced person that could do that and do it for 3 or 4 sets and then come back 2 days later and those muscle groups are basically restored and ready to go and used again. Okay, so I think that similar biomechanical might be used for more the advanced person that's really looking at, hey, what's the best way for me to be efficient with my time and still work on improving my strength and muscle size, right? Because that similar biomechanics, we saw a huge decrease in how quickly you can perform the movement over time and how much power is being produced over time. Huge decreases, right? Over 50% decreases. But at the same time, they've had greater time under tension, which, reading between the lines again, we're increasing volume or amount of work we're doing because we're basically keeping that load and doing it for longer, which speaks more to improvements in strength and muscle size. Okay, so power, let's do those early on or by themselves. If you're more worried about strength and muscle size, try and give that similar biomechanical a shot if you've got the capacity for more workload ability to do so. So I would say putting it all together, I think supersets are a great way to be efficient with your exercise time, number 1. But number 2, making sure we're selecting the appropriate superset to perform based on our abilities and our capacity for overall work and recover from that amount of work. So again, anybody, whether you're beginner, intermediate, or advanced, we could, I think, alternate peripheral, right? The press, bench press, and the back squat, whatever that might be, is appropriate, as well as the agonist antagonist. On the flip side, maybe being a little bit more conservative if you are that beginner or intermediate, jumping into that similar biomechanical, because it is essentially producing more volume, which is a greater overload to your physiology, which takes longer to recover, and it may be a little bit too much work to jump straight into right out of the gate, okay? So thank you again for joining another week of Fitness Lit Breakdown. I love doing this podcast with you guys. I want to thank you again for your support, for listening, and all of your interest in all things exercise and fitness and science. If you'd be so kind, I always appreciate a rating. A 5-star rating on Apple iTunes is always appreciated. And a review, if you'd like to drop a comment or a review of this podcast. That only helps other people that want to get into this podcast, give them a sense of what we kind of talk about each week, and also allows this podcast to become more popular so it reaches more people so we can all get these tools and use them in our daily lives and our achievements of working towards improving our fitness. So thank you again, and join again next week for another episode of Fitness Lit Breakdown.